Tune out the noise. It's biblical perspective on world issues. It's Word and World, brought to you by Mr. K and the Buffalo Toyota Afternoon Drive, here on Link FM.
Oh, yes, indeed. It is Word and World time. And guess who's back? Yeah, the man himself, political analyst, writer, and what else do you do, Kanin?
Husband of one and a father of two.
Okay, husband of one and father of two, not the other way around.
No, it's certainly not.
Okay, fantastic. He's also a student, soon to be expert when it comes to leadership, from Bailie Leadership Consultancy. Welcome, Craig Bailie. Welcome back, Craig. Always a pleasure. How are you doing?
Thank you, Mr. K. Always good to be here. Yeah, I'm doing well, and I don't think excited would be the appropriate word, but thankful to have the opportunity to talk about the very important issue we'll be discussing.
Yeah. That is, of course, commemorating the International Day commemorating victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. Now, this is something that's close to your heart, Craig, personally, but I know it is professionally as well. And, you know, you've got an acronym for this. It is an acronym, right? The acronym is FORB. F-O-R-B. I think that would be a good place to start this conversation. We're talking about, people who suffer violence based on religion or belief. What is FORB?
Yeah. So FORB stands for, I think you've already said it, but I'll gladly expand, freedom of religion or belief. And I think the best place for us to find a definition of what FORB is, Mr. K, is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration was made in Paris in 1948, not long after the end of the Second World War. And Article 18 of the UDHR reads as follows: everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Now, this article, the whole declaration, was drafted in 1948. Some listeners might have picked up there I was only referring to his or him. Clearly, this is applicable across the two genders. But yes, that is the definition of FORB. In short, freedom of religion or belief. And this really is what the International Day that was commemorated last Thursday.
Yes.
When we talk about victims of violence based on religion or belief, it forms part of this wider notion of freedom of religion or belief. And clearly we have victims here who have been targeted either because of the religion or the beliefs they hold, or because of the religion or beliefs held by the perpetrators of the violence.
Okay, now, Craig, why exactly did the United Nations decide in 2019 to commemorate the victims of such violence? Was it for religious purposes?
Well, I think, as I've just said, FORB was, I think, a milestone in our conceptualization and understanding of FORB was the UDHR proclaimed in 1948. But then, as you've just mentioned, in 2022, we have the United Nations General Assembly sitting up and saying, we actually need a day to commemorate the victims of violence based on religion or belief. And part of their reasoning, Mr. K, was that we've seen an increase in violence perpetrated in the name of or because of religion. And we have several organizations who, through their research outside of the UN, who have also picked up on a similar trend. We can talk about the Pew Research Center, who in 2021 found that harassment of religious groups returned to peak level since 2007, which is when that particular research institute started tracking this type of trend. And when we talk about harassment, This includes of a physical kind, like property damage, assaults on people, detentions, displacements, and also killings. Similarly, Open Doors International, an organization that also works to promote FORB and support persecuted Christians, including in sub-Saharan Africa, it found in 2022 through its research that violence in the name of religion is at an all-time high in the region. And then lastly, the African Center for Strategic Studies have also found that Islamic militant group activities have increased in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in those areas where we've seen military governments taking over.
Endless praise on Link FM, linking people to Jesus. The voice of truth. Link FM, linking people to Jesus.
We're basically discussing the International Day commemorating victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief that was observed last week. It was on the 22nd. There you go. 22nd of August. And we're speaking about FORB, and then we also mentioned that the UN decided to commemorate the victims of such violence, as we mentioned before, in 2019. But now, Craig, the question is, why is this persecution even taking place? Perhaps for the benefit of those who missed out on your explanation of what FORB is, perhaps let's start there, and then let's answer the question as to why people are suffering such violence based on religion or belief.
Yeah, Mr. Kaiser, just again, FORB stands for Freedom of Religion or Belief. And I think let me first say from a scriptural perspective, is it in Timothy where we are cautioned, we are told as Christians to expect persecution, certainly in as far as we are walking with God. Yeah. So persecution is inevitable. I think what shifts from one society or country to the next is the degree of persecution and the nature of persecution. So if I just think for a moment about the interview that Link FM had this morning with Liesl Pretorius of 4SA, they will approach persecution specifically in the South African context, but will look at persecution from a slightly different lens compared to an organization such as Open Doors, for example. The latter is more focused on persecution in the rest of the continent, and the nature of that persecution is very different from the kind of persecution a South African might experience. And I use those words carefully, because when we talk about persecution, what some might call persecution in South Africa, one could even contest the fact that anyone in this country is experiencing persecution in a significant sense when compared to the kind of persecution we see elsewhere in the continent. So I think our friends from 4SA will be more knowledgeable about what is confronting religious freedom in South Africa. What comes to mind is the Bella Bill, for example, the hate speech bill. But when we talk about religious persecution in the rest of the continent, to put it crudely, we're talking about the hacking off of limbs and loss of life.
Sure.
It's those extremes that we start talking about, those extremes. So I've spoken about this idea of religious persecution, violence based on religion from a Christian, scriptural perspective, very briefly. But from a normative perspective, I would like to think to most listeners it would make sense to say that any person or organization, including the state, that is inclined to impose himself, herself, or itself on others, will also be inclined to feel either threatened or disempowered by anyone or any community that claims a belief in a transcendent supreme being. And so in different parts of Africa where you have the state or any particular regime posing as the God in any particular instance, and you then have members of any faith, whether it's Christian or Muslims, taking a stand against that authority, a legitimate stand, because that authority happens to be overstepping its jurisdiction, we can understand then how that authority might feel threatened and might react. So I think that's one reason why one would generally see members of a religion, including Christians certainly, being persecuted because of their faith. We're talking here about the sincere believers in a particular religion who are willing to take a stand against authorities who are overstepping their jurisdiction.
Now, Craig, in recent times, we have seen a surge, when it comes to FORB violations, particularly on the continent of Africa. Why do you think that is? Why is it that we've seen an uptake of persecution based on faith or religion on this continent?
I think any explanation has to be multifaceted, Mr. K. So, one thing to consider, one reality we can't leave out of that explanation is the number of coups that have taken place across the Sahel region. This is a region stretching from the coast of Guinea all the way to the coast of Sudan, where we have military coups taking place. We have civilian governments being overthrown. And ironically, when these coups take place, often the militaries justify the act by saying, we want to improve security. And in almost all these respects, in almost all of these countries, we have security regressing rather than improving. Why? Because you have an organization that is designed, equipped, and trained for warfare and not for civil governance. So that's another possible reason why in those circumstances, in those contexts, we see militant organizations, religious extremists becoming more prominent than under the civilian governments, whether those civilian governments were democratic or not. I think we're also seeing globally a regression in democracy. I'm reminded of the Washington Post headline a few years ago that read, "Democracy is dead." And I think as long as democratic governance is on the decline in any region of the world, it's safe to assume that FORB is also going to be challenged, because there's a positive correlation between democracy and freedom of religion or belief. I think there are also other issues we need to consider, for example, climate change. I'm certainly not a climate alarmist, but I do believe in the notion of climate change. And I think where climate change is affecting African landscapes, we have people of different ethnic groups, different cultures, and different beliefs meeting one another where previously they wouldn't have. And often that meeting is a place of tension, where religion plays a role, and you'll have Christians bearing the brunt in those conflicts.
Very interesting, Craig. I'd also like to perhaps add a third dynamic there. The growth of the church in Africa. The rate at which African people are turning to Jesus and are following God.
Absolutely.
Don't you think there's a correlation there?
Excellent point.
There's a boom, there's a boom when it comes to the church, as it were, all over the African continent, and that could lead to increased persecution as well.
So Africa as a region is the most religious continent in the world. It is also the continent that hosts, or that is inhabited by, the largest Christian population. Not only that, according to a study by Pew Research, Christians in Africa are the most committed. whatever that may mean. Regular prayer, regular attendance of church services or church gatherings, for example. So I think just the mere fact that we have such a large Christian population in Africa, it makes sense then that if persecution is inevitable, we're likely to see higher levels or rates of persecution, even higher rates of violent persecution, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, as a distinction from the rest of the continent compared to other regions of the world. So an astute point, I agree with you there 100%. What just on some recent reading I've done, what I find interesting when researching the special envoys, the institutions, the organizations and the bodies that have been established to protect and advance FORB internationally, they are all based largely either in America or in Europe. Listeners will already be aware of the non-state actor, I've mentioned them earlier, 4SA in South Africa, that's looking after this particular national space. But I'm not finding any equivalent organizations or institutions to those that we find in the US and in Europe. And I'm still trying to figure out why this is the case, especially in a continent where we have so many committed Christians.
The voice of truth. Link FM. Linking people to Jesus. Reaching out and touching lives. Link FM.
Still here with Craig Bailie in the studio, and today he's here to help us unpack this whole situation that we're seeing prevailing throughout particularly the African continent, where people are suffering violence and even death based on religion or belief. And we've covered some ground. If you've just joined us, we've defined what FORB is, and we've spoken about why the UN decided to commemorate the victims of such violence, and also talking about why FORB is being violated to the degree that it is in Africa. On this continent in particular. And Craig and I were just having a chat off air, and I was just letting him know that I've actually got a relative who is in the SANDF, South African National Defence Force, and in July, somewhere around there, they return from Mozambique. They were doing some work over there. Those who are in the know, that the northern region of Mozambique has been under intense persecution for the last 5 years or so. So they were sent there on a peacekeeping mission, and they returned from their duties over there, having done what they were sent there to do. But of course, it's not really up to them to fix this problem. They can only do what they're trained to do, right? But there needs to be a holistic approach in an attempt to solve this problem. Isn't that right, Craig? And what would that holistic approach then look like? Because listen, a soldier is a soldier, a general is a general. A soldier's gonna soldier. He's gonna do what a soldier does. A general is gonna do what a general does. Okay, yeah. But obviously, you need more than that to fight this thing.
Yeah. So I think it's important for, I'm not going to say those in the know, because they potentially aren't in the know, which is why we're having this conversation in the first place. But certainly those with the power. In the relevant spaces. I'm not talking specifically about governments, and those who hold those governments accountable need to understand that the best preventative measure, or the best way of countering violent religious extremism, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, I'll explain in a moment why I talk about violent religious extremism and not religious fundamentalism. We'll get to that in a moment. But those in power need to understand that the best way of preventing and countering violent religious extremism is through good governance. And, some listeners might be asking, but what on earth is a leadership consultant doing talking about FORB and countering violent religious extremism or countering terrorism? Well, what issue in the space of human affairs is not affected by or does not involve leadership? And when we talk about FORB and FORB violations, which is what we're talking about when we're commemorating the victims of violence based on religion or belief, we are talking about a leadership failure. Certainly in those countries where this kind of thing, this kind of persecution, this kind of violence is happening en masse or on a large scale, one cannot deny that that is a leadership issue. It's a leadership failure at the national level. More specifically, it's a failure of good civil governance.
That's a big statement to make, Craig.
Well, I make the statement passionately because I believe it's true. I think it's important, again, that those in power recognize that, and that those who are holding them accountable help them to recognize that truth. I'm not anti-military. I appreciate the existence of military forces in any country, as long as they're doing what they were designed, equipped, and trained for, which is to engage in armed combat or to fight wars. To put it crudely, a soldier is trained to solve problems with a rifle. And that isn't enough to solve the problem of violent religious extremism. As I said a moment ago, the real solution, the real preventative measure is good governance, and you'll find and see and experience and taste and see good governance when you have leaders in power who care about human dignity. If I may just say something about the language we use. I like to distinguish between religious fundamentalism and violent religious extremism. What is the difference? Mm-hmm. In some circles, according to some definitions, I would be considered a religious fundamentalist, if only because of the values and principles I follow according to Christian scripture.
Yeah.
And I don't think, whether I'm a Christian or a Muslim, that shouldn't be a problem. Certainly not for the state or any government. I think when it becomes problematic is when let's call it religious fundamentalism, starts manifesting violently. We have to talk about violent religious fundamentalism. What denotes it is the violence. And I think that's when people start getting hurt, and that's when governments need to start paying attention to what these different actors are doing and bringing them into order.
Very interesting stuff indeed. Craig, we are almost out of time, so I am going to allow you to posit some final thoughts regarding this particular topic. You are, of course, a leadership consultancy, and you did highlight the importance of good governance and good leadership in attempting to fight this thing. So, yeah, there you go. Let me give you the final word. By the way, thank you so much to everybody who's joining us for this conversation. Taking a look over at WhatsApp, not a lot happening over there, but we know you're out there. You know, we know that you are listening intently to this here conversation. So let's close it. Craig, what can we do? What can people like you and I do who don't really have the political prowess to, make a difference, like a real difference, as those who currently hold power do?
May I begin my end with a story?
Begin your end.
In a country whose name I won't name, a parent left home on a work trip, and while this parent was gone, his child of a very young age happened to be outside the family home in the front yard singing a religious song. The neighbors heard the song, They didn't like it. They proceeded to move onto the property, where they chopped off 4 fingers off of this young child's hand. The other parent runs outside to shield the child, and this parent is in turn attacked by the perpetrators with a machete. Now imagine yourself being this parent who's away on a work trip. You come home to find your child and your spouse in hospital, recovering not just from grievous physical injuries, but also from extreme emotional trauma. And I'm just trying to highlight the seriousness of this issue of religious persecution, violence based on religion or belief. You ask me, what can we do? Well, I think I've said it before, knowledge is power. It is imperative that those who have a platform, and I'm speaking largely to a Christian audience here, beginning with church leaders, please start educating your congregations on the notion of religious persecution and this thing called freedom of religion or belief. I believe it's our biblical duty, it's our leadership duty to assist those in other parts of the world. Let's start at home. But as I said earlier on, I think the persecution we see happening in other parts of Africa are way more severe, they're way more physical. So we need to reach out to our government, to the political leaders we know. They need to advocate on behalf of, it doesn't just have to be Christians, but anyone who's the victim of this kind of violence. We need to lobby our representatives, our political leaders, who in turn need to advocate for the interests of those who are suffering this kind of violence elsewhere in the continent. They need to work through the Pan-African Parliament. They need to work through the African Union. They need to consider how they can leverage this organization called Citizens and Diaspora Organizations Directorate, which is part of the AU, but that has projects that indirectly are looking at but also more directly at countering violent religious extremism. But I think aside from prayer, which we Christians are rightly so, that's generally our starting point, it should be, but we also need to engage in action. And I think a good first step is to raise awareness about this issue, educate people on this issue, and from there have a conversation about what step 2 should be.
Reaching out and touching lives. Link FM.